Before we start, here's a little backstory. I grew up watching Friends. I joke that the main reason I know English is because of that show. I still unconditionally love and rewatch it. However, I always saw those characters as my elders. This hasn't changed, even though I'm now older than any of the Friends characters were at any point in the show. So when I hit my 20s, I craved a younger series in a similar vein. There were, of course, many shows trying to leech off the success of Friends, but none scratched that itch. And then I found How I Met Your Mother. It was funny, inventive, heartwarming, and featured brilliant characters. It spoke to me. I tuned in religiously for about 6 or 7 seasons. But then, the final 2 hit. Seasons 8 and 9 marked a huge dip in quality. My God, they were so boring and unfunny. I had to power through them just to reach the long-awaited finale, which turned out to be legendarily horrible. The only good thing that came out of it was Kristen Milioti, as it launched her career. There's a good reason why many fans prefer to consider the alternate ending to be canon. It helps us cope. Still, the memory of the entire show was tarnished for me, which is why I've never done a complete rewatch of How I Met Your Mother, even though I've rewatched Friends, Seinfeld, and 30 Rock many times. I didn't even revisit the seasons I actually loved, or should I say, I hadn't, until this project finally pushed me to do so. I was happy to confirm for myself that the early seasons still hold up, but let's not get ahead of ourselves, because in this video, I'll actually be covering 2 shows. Enter the Russian version of How I Met Your Mother. In 2010, at the height of my love for How I Met Your Mother, I learned that there was a Russian remake of the show. I gave it a spin, watched the first season, and quit. I thought it lacked identity and charm. It wasn't funny, and worst of all, it was just cheap and lazy. This turned out to be a popular opinion. Despite the original show's popularity in Russia, the remake was cancelled after just 2 seasons. It was soon forgotten, though it lives on in memes. It's brought up on Russian internet forums whenever bad remakes are discussed. 15 years later, I decided to give the show another try. I started watching both versions simultaneously to spot as many differences as possible and categorize them. I took over 80 pages of notes in the process. I'll cover those in upcoming videos. In this one, I just want to share my thoughts on the Russian remake and somewhat defend the show, because honestly, I think it deserves a reevaluation. I once made a video where I mildly defended The Theorists, an awful Belarusian show accused by Chuck Lorre of being a rip-off and direct translation of The Big Bang Theory. I agreed it clearly violated copyright law, but I disagreed that it was a straightforward translation. It was more original than people gave it credit for, while still being generic and painfully unfunny. I bring this up because in the case of the Russian How I Met Your Mother, there were no legal controversies, as the studio acquired the rights. However, the most common criticism is that every episode is a direct Russian translation of the original. The final product somehow manages to be a carbon copy while also being inferior in every way imaginable. It's like the infamous Gus Van Sant shot-for-shot remake of Psycho. It's hard to disagree, especially after watching the pilot. It feels like someone took the American script, translated it into Russian, replaced a few key words, and called it a day. As a result, now we follow Dima the architect, who in the future tells this epic story to his 2 kids. Dima lives in Moscow with his friend Pasha, a law student. Pasha is in a sweet, loving relationship with Lucia, a kindergarten teacher and aspiring painter. Their other friend is Yura, who wears suits exclusively and always hits on women. Then, suddenly, Dima falls for Katya, a TV reporter who just moved to Moscow from Belarus. They go out, have a wonderful date, but Dima screws everything up by telling Katya he loves her. Does it sound uncannily familiar? You get the picture. If you don't speak Russian, you could basically watch the episode with English subtitles from the original and barely notice a difference. Just fix the timestamps. Rewatching this felt like watching the fictional show Jerry in Seinfeld, or that scene in Friends with Joey's not-so-identical twin. You recognize the lines and characters, but something is off. These are basically cosplayers. Dima never feels like his own character. He's always the Russian Ted. That was my reaction to the pilot 15 years ago, and honestly, not much has changed. The show's cardinal sin is already evident in episode 1. By not differentiating itself from the original, it set itself up to fail 100% of the time. When it's good, all credit goes to the American version. When it's bad, we blame the Russian creators. Unless you dig into both versions deeply, like I did, you'll never know that the remake actually had some good ideas. Despite being a beat-for-beat copy, it introduces certain changes. I'll discuss the differences between the two versions in a series of upcoming videos. For now, I want to present a mild defense of the Russian remake, because I believe it's actually a decent show. Not legendary, but not deserving of all the hate either. First, you have to accept that this series is, by nature, unoriginal. It's the same How I Met Your Mother, recreated for a Russian audience. That's important to remember. Comparisons to pointless remakes like the so-called live-action Lion King don't apply here. We're talking about targeting entirely different viewer groups, or at least that was the intention. The reality is, nowadays more and more Russians understand English and are familiar with American pop culture. The original show is also popular in Russia with voiceovers. So, the remake was never in high demand. Still, the lack of originality isn't necessarily a problem. The American The Office remains one of the greatest sitcoms of all time, even though it began as a faithful remake of the UK original, before forging its own identity. The real question is then, how well was the show adapted, and does it have a unique comedic voice? First, I want to give some credit to the Russian cast. Let's start with Ted, or rather Dima, played by Alexander Skotnikov, who in 2011 changed his surname to Ratnikov. I've always said that How I Met Your Mother doesn't succeed because of its main premise, but in spite of it. Ted's search for the perfect love is as generic as it gets, and the constant teasing is often frustrating. It's the lost of sitcoms. Episodes focusing on Ted's love life tend to be on the weaker side. Luckily, the creators realized early on that the real gold lay in the other characters. I'm not a fan of Ted in general, and by extension of Dima either. That said, I really like Mr. Ratnikov. He's a fine actor with a substantial stage career. My problem with Josh Radnor's Ted was that I always found him more smug than charming, even in the early seasons before the series leaned into making him a bit of a snob. Ratnikov, on the other hand, is genuinely sweet, harmless, and charming. I buy him as a hopeless romantic much more than I ever did Radnor. Thumbs up. I think most people would agree that the breakout character of How I Met Your Mother was Barney. I remember buying my brother-in-law books allegedly written by him. Remember those? Anyway, Russian Barney is called Yura and is played by Alexander Smirnov. In terms of appearance, he's easily the most controversial casting choice. He looks nothing like Neil Patrick Harris, who has a very distinct physique. If it weren't for the suit, you'd never guess who he's meant to be. But I actually really like Smirnov in the role. The thing is, Barney isn't Joey from Friends. He's not the type who just looks at a woman and she melts, even though he thinks he is. He's a Weasley conman who tricks women into sleeping with him, especially early on in the series. He's flashy, talks a big game, but as we gradually learn, He's deeply insecure, which makes him childishly competitive. He treats hookups like a sport. Smirnov as Yura doesn't look like a typical romantic lead, but he nails the sleaziness and even the pathetic undertones. In my opinion, he successfully captures the essence of Barney, and that's what really matters. Next, we have Pasha, played by Valentin Stepanov, now professionally known as Valentin Val. He's another solid actor who makes a great version of Marshall. He's properly lovable and goofy, but also has a tougher side. When he gets mad, you believe it. He can sing and is a masterful dancer. I do wonder why the casting team gave him that weird haircut, though. With shorter hair, he actually resembles Jason Segel more. Maybe the longer style makes him look less threatening. Val is ripped and in amazing shape, and that's not exactly the vibe you want from Marshall. Or maybe the micro-afro makes him seem taller. Which brings me to one of my critiques, not of the actor, but of the showrunners. Jason Segel is 6'4", and Marshall's height was part of the character. He was often referred to as the tall guy, at least when other members of his family weren't around. In the Russian remake, it's stated that Pasha is 2 meters tall, or about 6'7", but that's clearly not the case. Val's official website lists him at 6 foot flat. He's the tallest among the cast, but he never towers over anyone, except Lucia. If your actor isn't exceptionally tall, then don't draw attention to his height. I focus on this because it's symptomatic of a larger issue. The Russian remake sometimes copies elements from the original series without adapting them to fit. Pasha's not-so-impressive height is just one example. For visual comparison, check out episode 12 of Season 2, which features well-known sports journalist Dmitry Guberniev, who actually is 6'7". That's how tall Pasha would look next to Yura if the show's claim were accurate. The best thing I can say about Val's Pasha is that he has wonderful chemistry with Anna Kuzminskaya, who plays Lucia. You can't imagine How I Met Your Mother without a great Marshall and Lily, and the Russian version delivers. These two are really cute together. You can tell they care about each other. They're playful and funny. I'd say Lucia is more frantic than Lily. She comes off as more confident and less helpless. She also has even less patience for Russian Barney and his antics. Lily's decision to leave Marshall and pursue her own dreams late in Season 1 always felt a bit off to me. I wish the show had introduced that aspect of her character earlier. With Lucia, though, I buy it. Overall, this character even shares a few traits with Robin, which isn't a bad thing because Katya, played by Tatiana Fyodorovskaya, is easily the weakest part of the cast. The original Robin was just cool, sarcastic, hilarious, cynical at times, but also vulnerable. She was a female bro, which made sense given her upbringing by her father. No wonder she and Barney were such a brilliant pairing, and should have ended up together if you ask me. Kobe Smulders did a fantastic job as Robin. Unfortunately, Fyodorovskaya doesn't have a fraction of her range. Most importantly, she lacks the cool factor. She plays the romantic interest well and can be funny at times, but you just don't buy her as a bro. She's the weakest link, and that's a shame. That covers the main cast. Overall, I'd say they did a great job with what they were given. As for the supporting actors, they're a mixed bag, often on the weaker side. The most notorious is the kid who didn't know how to act surprised when finding Pasha on the toilet, so he opened the door already screaming. Now let's tease the upcoming series of videos and discuss some of the changes I mentioned to show that the people adapting this series weren't as lazy as it might seem at times. Sure, they often substituted American phenomena with Russian ones, but sometimes there was more thought behind these decisions. Here are some examples. Before Robin becomes a news anchor, she does a bunch of fluff pieces. In episode 4 of the first season, she covers a hot dog vendor at City Hall. However, in the remake, she reports on a Lenin impersonator near the Kremlin. If you've ever been to Moscow, you've probably seen people dressed as historical Russian and Soviet leaders, especially Peter the Great, Lenin and Stalin. You might find it messed up, but that's a very specific and grounded cultural detail, and I'm glad the show incorporated it. It makes the remake feel less like a direct American transplant, and that's exactly the point. By the way, Lenin wasn't the only Russian celebrity to grace the show. The full list is actually surprisingly long and dwarfs the number of celebrities that made cameos in the OG show, but we'll get to that. Now, episode 6 of season 1 presents a less effective change. In the OG series, Ted mentions that one of the reasons why the girl dressed as a slutty pumpkin is so awesome is that she loves Star Wars, including the Ewoks. For various reasons, Star Wars fandom was never particularly big in Russia, at least not until the 2000s. But you know what was big? The Lord of the Rings. So in the Russian remake, Dima says the slutty pumpkin loves Lord of the Rings, including the Hobbits. But here's the problem. While the Ewoks' inclusion in Return of the Jedi was divisive, is there any Tolkien fan who hates the Hobbits? They might be small like Ewoks, but they're not controversial, so the change, while logical on the surface, doesn't land in the same way as replacing a hot dog vendor with Lenin. I'm a language nerd. I appreciate wordplay and inventive use of language. How I Met Your Mother excels at both. Barney, in particular, has some hilarious lines and multiple catchphrases. So, as you can imagine, translating them from English to Russian poses serious challenges, given how vastly different the two languages are. The team responsible for adapting the scripts had a rough start, because the first episode is already quite tricky in terms of linguistic humor. Here's the prime example. For Barney, the suit is an identity, a panacea. No wonder he turned "suit up" into a catchphrase. It's short, sharp, sounds like a military command, conveys urgency. After all, a suit is a universal problem solver, at least according to Barney. Meanwhile, the Russian translation, "Надень костюм," lacks that punch. It's clunky. Just a plain imperative, meaning put on the suit. Russian speakers tend to use imperatives more casually than English speakers, so the phrase doesn't feel urgent or special. Plus, Barney often plays with his catchphrase, saying things like "snowsuit up" or "slut up," which adds layers that are hard to replicate. Failing to recognize "suit up" as a key phrase led to many other problems along the way. And by the way, I actually like the alternative, "priodенься," which I found in Russian subtitles of the original show. It's one verb, but it's rich in meaning, implying someone is dressing more nicely than usual. It's short, stylish, and has urgency. So a better solution was definitely possible. However, if you go beyond the first episode, you'll find many good examples where the Russian translators shone creativity and humor. For instance, in episode 7 of season 1, Barney tells Ted that behind his back, they've started using his name as a verb. To Ted out, meaning to overthink, and to Ted up, to overthink with disastrous results. The Russian remake invents two analogous verbs, "dimat" and "pradimat." It's absolutely ingenious. These forms incorporate Dima's name and also cleverly play on the real Russian verbs "dumat" and "produmat," meaning to think and to think through. I'd argue this version is even better than the original. To be fair, there are probably more examples of the Russian translators phoning it in than excelling. Still, it's not fair to say the adaptation was entirely lazy or unfunny. It's worth mentioning that the remake occasionally features completely original scenes added just before the closing credits. These moments are usually brief, but they often serve as satisfying closures to certain story arcs. For example, in episode 5 of season 1, Lily talks to her uptight colleague about the previous night. She's embarrassed to admit that they partied hard at a bar. Later in the episode, she organizes a dull wine-tasting party and invites the colleague, but ultimately, both Lily and Marshall ditch the event and join Ted and Barney at a dance club. That's where the episode ends in the original. The remake, however, adds a follow-up scene. A drunken Lucia, Pasha, and Dima return home to find the boring party still going on. Lucia then grabs a whole bottle of wine and chugs it in front of everyone. It's a nice touch that completes her character arc, from being ashamed of her lifestyle to fully embracing it, even if she's in a committed relationship and nearing 30. Another example comes from episode 18 of the same season, where Barney mentors 2 high school seniors. It's a funny dynamic because he's finally found someone who actually wants to learn from him how to live, unlike Ted. The remake goes a step further by adding a longer extra scene with the teens. Yura not only teaches them where to find the G-spot, but also shares one of his signature pickup lines. "I bet if you turn around, I'll say wow." It's a great way to wrap up the episode. Funny enough, the remake gives us a hint about what Yura's job is as early as episode 15 of season 1. In the OG series, we don't learn this about Barney until season 9. Here, however, it seems that Yura is an FSB agent, a role that fits the Russian setting perfectly. It explains the wealth, the overconfidence, the peculiar network of connections, and the manipulative tendencies. It's a great addition, and unlike Barney's mysterious job, it doesn't feel like a stretch. Even though I could list countless smaller and larger changes introduced by the remake, I'll admit it directly follows the original about 80% of the time. It plays out exactly the same. Most of the differences come down to individual lines or jokes. The issues don't stop there. Some episodes are missing. The first 2 seasons of the original show each had 22 episodes, while the remake has only 20 per season. Because of this, the romantic relationship between Dima and Katya has less time to develop. For example, the fairly important limo episode, which ends with Ted and Robin's New Year's kiss, doesn't appear in the remake. There's also an interesting case where 2 episodes from the original are merged into one. Episode 9 of Season 2 features Pasha and Lucia visiting his parents, while Yura's brother comes to town and takes the rest of the gang to a club. And yes, in case you were wondering, Barney's brother James, who is black and gay in the original, is definitely straight in the remake. Continuing with the topic of time constraints, it's worth mentioning that the remake sometimes suffers from poor pacing. Russian words tend to be longer than their English equivalents, so when translating English dialogue into Russian, the script often ends up about 30% lengthier. Certain scenes and jokes don't have time to breathe or land properly as they do in the original. Some of the editing choices remind me of the breakneck pace of The Rise of Skywalker, and that's not a good thing. There's one more issue I want to highlight. You'll notice right away that almost no scenes in the remake are shot outdoors. There are a few, but far fewer than in the original series. This is most likely due to budget constraints. As a result, the show can feel claustrophobic, with most scenes set indoors, usually in a dimly lit bar or the equally dark apartment of Dima and Pasha. All of that said, I honestly think the Russian remake of How I Met Your Mother is an okay show, as long as you accept that it will never be better than the original. I like the cast, and I really enjoy the language, but its cardinal sin is that it's not different enough. It's like covering someone else's song. A cover will always be compared to the original. Unless you manage to truly make it your own and put your unique stamp on it, your version will come off as inferior and unnecessary. That's precisely the issue with this show. If you know English, watch the original. It's far superior. If you don't, you're better off watching the original with a Russian voiceover. The remake is really just a curiosity for people who enjoy exploring other cultures. I just happen to be one of them, which hopefully explains my reasoning. Next time, we'll dive into many more of the changes introduced by the Russian remake. Meanwhile, if you enjoyed the video, consider liking, commenting, and sharing it with your friends. Stay legendary. Bye.